This video will discuss the advantages and disadvantages for a t-test for two related samples, and then we'll discuss a little bit about how maybe we could control for some of these disadvantages. So just like with the other statistical tests that we've discussed, there are some factors that are going to influence the hypothesis test outcome. So some factors that will influence the hypothesis test outcome that we've discussed previously are the size of the sample mean difference. So the difference between the means is going to affect the hypothesis test. The bigger the sample mean difference, the more likely you'll get a significant result. Sample size. Again, we want a good size sample. An N of 30 is an appropriate size sample. And sample variance. The smaller the variance, because that goes in the denominator, the bigger your t statistic will be, and the more likely you'll be to have a significant result. Now then, let's think about factors that would affect effect size. It's our sample variance. So how much variance we have in our samples is going to be the main factor affecting our effect size. Sample size does not come into play when we talk about effect size. So remember, the variance is a measure of consistency. So when treatment has a consistent effect, the scores, those different scores, will cluster closer together and variability will be low. If there's an inconsistent effect, those different scores will be more scattered and the variability will be high. So now for some advantages of the repeated measures design. If you think about it, it requires a lot less subjects because you have the same subjects in your different conditions. It allows us to study changes over time. We can take a group of individuals and study them now, 6 months from now, and a year from now. It reduces or eliminates, for the most part, the influence of individual differences. We don't have we have the same individual differences in condition 1 that we do in condition 2 and condition 3 because they're repeating those measurements. So that's going to substantially decrease the variability in our scores. Of course, there are some disadvantages to the t-test. Otherwise, we wouldn't have alternative designs. Factors besides the treatment may cause the subject's scores to change during time between measurements. There are things that we don't necessarily have the time to talk about here, but there's history effects, there's practice effects, there's fatigue, there's order effects. So participation in the first treatment may influence scores in the second treatment. And like I mentioned, there are some other ones as well that you may learn more about in more detail in other classes. But we're going to discuss a little bit more these order effects, the idea that treatment in the first condition could influence a score in the second condition, and how would we control for that? So how could a researcher control for order effects? We do something called counterbalancing. So counterbalancing is a way to control for these time-related or order effects. So the idea is if you have group 1 do treatment A first, and followed by treatment B, and then you give them a test, how do you know, or you give them a test at both of these treatment times, how do you know that there isn't an order effect? They do differently on the test because treatment A came first, followed by treatment B. Well, you counterbalance that by having another group do treatment B first, followed by treatment A, and then your test. So there are ways we can also approximate the advantage of a repeated measures design without some of those disadvantages, the order effects that we might have. So it's called a matched subject design, and this is where 2 separate samples are actually used, but each individual in the sample is matched 1-to-1 with an individual in the other sample. And they're matched on some sort of relevant variable. Participants are not necessarily identical to their match, but it ensures that samples are equivalent with respect to some specific variable. So you choose 1 or 2 variables, whether it's age and gender, socioeconomic status, whatever you think might influence your experiment in a between subjects design, and you match those participants. So it has an advantage of the repeated measures to decrease those individual differences, but the strengths of the between subjects where you don't necessarily have those order effects.